So here we go with the story of the Crusades. And so what we're also doing now is getting to the point where we're kind of coming to the end of the Middle Ages. We have only a few more lectures left on the Middle Ages. And what I would say is that these events that we're going to be talking about, the Crusades, Hundred Years' War, a couple other events, they're very important as part of the Middle Ages, but they're also part of why the Middle Ages ends. And one of the things you definitely want to be paying attention to as we kind of move forward in the next several lectures is why do the Middle Ages end? What brings about an end to this time period? And there are going to be about four big events. Excuse me. There are going to be about four big events that are going to end the Middle Ages. The Crusades plays a small role. As we get closer to the 1300s, we're going to see other events that have a bigger role. So you're going to want to pay attention to that. It's one of your possible essay questions for the final. And I'm going to kind of emphasize that more as we get closer to kind of the impacts of these things. So for the Crusades, we're basically going to be looking at a few things. We're going to talk about the causes of the Crusades. You need to know that. We're going to talk about kind of the four major Crusades that take place. And then finally, we're going to talk about the impacts of the Crusades. And they have pretty significant impacts, as you're going to see. All right, so let's get going with our first set of keywords. And these are the kind of the keywords for the causes of the Crusades. Why do the Crusades happen? And there are a number of reasons why the Crusades take place. A lot of people think it's simply this religious war. It's a bit more complex than that. Yes, part of the cause of the Crusades have to do with religion, but there are other factors as well that are going to be important as to why the Crusades happen. So get these keywords down, and I'm going to kind of go to our map here and start talking about the events leading up to the First Crusade and then the other Crusades. And you see these keywords take you all the way down to the First Crusade, and then we'll move forward to the other ones. All right. So here's our map that we're going to be using. I'll kind of go from this map to other images and back to this map. But these are the four Crusades that we're going to want to know, the first four. And the question is, why do they happen? So definitely one of the reasons for the Crusades is this idea of reclaiming the Holy Land, right? This Holy Land, Jerusalem, other cities like Akko, that's why I put the key word there as well. Jerusalem is, of course, the biggest prize. But this entire area you see kind of in this pinkish color there on the map where Jerusalem is, that area had first been under Jewish control, then under Christian control, then under Islamic control, if you remember when we talked about the spread of Islam. And then that was around the 700 period. And now several hundred years later, there's a desire to take this land and put it back under Christian control. So definitely one of the causes of the Crusades is that the Middle Ages are kind of this age of faith. There's definitely, this desire to go and get this piece of real estate and put it under Christian control again. Jerusalem is a very holy site for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. It's for Christians, it's of course where you have a very famous church there called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Actually, I have an image of it. There it is, Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It is actually the church where you have the tomb of Christ. And here you can see an image of the tomb of Christ. These are just pictures I snapped when I was there. There's also a very famous road there. I don't know if you've ever heard of this road, but it's called the Via Dolorosa, and it is the place where Christ walked with a cross. So definitely one of the causes of the Crusades was religious motivations. There were other things as well that motivated people to go on the crusade as well. There were, for some people, strategic reasons. I remember the Seljuks we had talked about and how the Seljuks had moved into the Byzantine Empire in Asia Minor. Well, if you think of the spread of the Islamic faith as it spread through North Africa, then into Spain, and then after Spain, then you had the Seljuks, and they take over the eastern part of the Byzantine Empire. If you look at the map, it's basically kind of, surrounding Western Christendom. And so for some people, it was a strategic war. It wasn't simply about, religion. It was about how can we make, a defense against maybe a possible invasion. So for some people, that was a motivation for the crusade. So that would be a second one. A third kind of cause for the crusade that I think you would want to know is economics. And what I mean by that is this idea of primogeniture. It was one of those key words. What does that word mean? Primogeniture basically means the eldest son inherits. And one of the traditions in the Middle Ages in the West was the eldest son inherits. Well, that's great if you're the eldest son. If you're not the eldest son, then you got a problem, right? Then how do you get land? Well, one way to acquire land is to go on a crusade. You know, one of the things about the Holy Land, Jerusalem, all that region that again I'll bring up on the map again and show you in a minute here. It's very sparsely populated land. I mean, in the 1800s, there was very few people living in there, let alone, back then in the Middle Ages. So it wasn't a very populated piece of real estate, yet it's very valuable. It's right on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. There's a lot of resources there. And so that was a motivation as well. So I think those are your kind of the big three, right? You have religious motivations, you have strategic motivations, and you have economic motivations why the Crusades happen. The last thing I want to mention in terms of why the Crusades happen have to do with the Pope at the time. And so this is Pope Urban II. And in 1095, Urban II goes to France and he makes a big old speech calling for a crusade. I'm just going to read to you a little paragraph. And as I read this paragraph, kind of pay attention to what he's doing to try to motivate people to go on the crusade. He says the following. O bravest of knights, descendants of unconquered ancestors, do not be weaker than they, but remember their courage. Set out on the road to the Holy Sepulchre. Take that land from the wicked people and make it your own. Jerusalem is the best of all lands and more fruitful than all others. This land our Savior made illustrious by his birth, beautiful with his life, and sacred with his suffering. This royal city is now held captive by our enemies and made pagan by those who know not God. She asks and longs to be liberated and does not cease to beg you to come to her aid. Set on this journey, obtain the remission of your sins, and be sure of the incorruptible glory of the kingdom of heaven. So what is the Pope doing? Well, he's using faith, but he's also even using land. He talked about the land of, the best of all lands, more fruitful than all others. So even the Pope is using this economic angle to try to get, people to go on the Crusades. Notice the verbiage he uses to describe the Muslim people in the West, in the East, right, in a very negative light, and that kind of tells you something about the time, of course. And then the last point is this also ties in with this concept of the Middle Ages being the age of faith, right? Who calls for a crusade? Not a king, but a pope. And other popes did as well, but when Pope Urban does this in 1095, this really gets things going. In fact, there was a man named Peter the Hermit, and Peter the Hermit, or sometimes called Peter the Hermit, leads what is sometimes called the People's Crusade or the Peasants' Crusade. And this People or Peasants' Crusade is basically when this guy named Peter the Hermit says, Pope says go on a crusade, he goes with a bunch of peasants to go off on a crusade, they all get slaughtered. Now, why am I mentioning it? It's not a super important story, except it does show the religious zeal of the time, that the Pope says jump, people go ha ha. I don't think if a Pope would say just go on a crusade, the average Joe in the United States would just go and risk their lives because the Pope said so. Back then, Pope said so, and people did. And I think that kind of shows us the religious zeal of the time again. So anyways, those are the events leading up to the First Crusade. All right, so I hope all that's clear. And here's the key words for the First Crusade, actually. So you have, Peter the Hermit I just mentioned, the People or Peasants Crusade, and then some other terms here that we're going to get as we start talking about the First Crusade and the aftermath, including this pretty crazy story of these group of people known as the Knights Templars. These kind of last four, I'll go with that thing. Okay, the story of the Knights Templars. All right, so let's move on. So get those words down, okay, and we'll move forward. All right, so here's your map again. And so, as I said, you have that People Crusade or Peasants Crusade by Peter the Hermit. And then you have the First Crusade. And the First Crusade makes its way all the way from the Western world, and they make their way to the Middle East. And they conquer a good chunk of land there. Again, everything you see kind of in that pinkish color there is conquered by the Crusaders. Also, again, to point out the Seljuks, right? These are the Seljuks up here. Remember, they took over this area. As I mentioned, the Islamic faith had moved into Spain, and that's the point I was making earlier. If you're living in the West, it looks like you're being surrounded. So, that was the thing I can kind of show you on the map a little better now. So anyways, so you have that situation, and the First Crusade goes, and it's very successful. They conquer a lot of land there. Now, as a result of that, one of the cool stories we get as a result of the First Crusade is the story of what we call the Knights Templar. Now, who are the Knights Templars? Well, they're these guys, right? Here's that image I kind of had in the beginning. It is a crazy little story about a group of knights that were also religious figures. And the reason they came about was because after the First Crusade, the land is now under Christian control. And so people in the West wanted to go on pilgrimages. They wanted to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. But they wouldn't want to go by themselves. You want a knight and you want a religious figure. You want a knight for protection. You want a religious figure as somebody who can guide you through all the religious sites. And so we have a special 2-for-1 deal, these Knights Templars. So these Knights Templars, they start leading the pilgrimages and they become very wealthy, right? And that man, Count Hugh de Pont, he was the first one to kind of organize them. Now, one of the key words there. And then they get bigger and bigger and larger in numbers. And they become very powerful and very wealthy. In fact, the Crusades come and go. The Knights Templars are still very much around. The Knights Templars started to develop, a lot of wealth and very powerful like strongholds and fortresses throughout the Middle East and in Western Europe. Here's a map that I'm just showing you. Every one of these kind of little castle-like images is a major fort of the Knights Templars. And they had a lot of money and a lot of influence as we move through the 1100s, 1200s, 1300s. In one city, Acre, I know it's spelled A-C-R-E, but it's pronounced Acre. They had this amazing fort. These are pictures I snapped when I was there. This is just from the outside. This is an image on the inside of it. And they were becoming very wealthy and very popular. And as they were becoming wealthy and popular, there were some people who were getting a little concerned, including Philip IV. Who is Philip IV? Philip IV was the king of France, very powerful king of France. He was the king of France, remember, who basically put the Pope in house arrest. Remember that story in the church-state conflict? Same Philip IV. So he starts to get worried that the Knights Templars, who began from France actually, were becoming too popular and too wealthy. And so in the early 1300s, Philip IV starts sending rumors and stories about the Knights Templars, that they were not this wonderful group of loyal Christian crusading knights, but instead that they were a secret society of demon worshippers, that they worshiped some demon cat, that they practiced homosexual behavior, that they would urinate on the cross. And, people started to believe these rumors that he was spreading. And once enough people had believed these rumors, then Philip gave the order to round them up. When does he give the order to round them up? Well, it was 1307, it was Friday, and it was October, Friday the 13th. So this is where we believe Friday the 13th, one theory at least, of where Friday the 13th becomes an unlucky number. So the Knights Templars are basically rounded up, tortured, and most of them are killed. And that's kind of where most of the history we know of the Knights Templars ends. But then there's this whole mythology of the Knights Templars, that some of the Knights Templars survived, that some of the Knights Templars escaped and they became kind of this secret society that holds all the secrets of the Holy Grail. And, it's all the great stories and movies and books. If you've ever read those old Dan Brown books, if you're familiar with them, like the Da Vinci Code and stuff, just kind of for fun type of stories. Well, the reality is, did any of the Knights Templars survive? And we believe some of them did. And actually, one of the cool things we found under the fortresses of Acre recently, when I say recently, in the last 30, 40 years, is secret tunnels that the Knights Templars had built. And here's a picture of these tunnels that I took when I was there. There's kind of these tunnels that go from the major part of Akko and they exit out right by the sea. And so we believe that the Knights Templars may have used these secret tunnels to escape. So maybe some of them did survive. Are they the secret holders of all known knowledge of the world? And, I doubt it. It's great for movies and stuff. But that's kind of an interesting little side story of the First Crusade. All right, so I wanted you to know a little bit about the Knights Templars as well. All right, so here are some more keywords and quite a few of them. So obviously you might need a pause to get them all down because I'm going to go to our map here to start talking about these other crusades. And I'm going to kind of show you what's going on. You'll have the dates on the map as well when you look at the crusades. So we'll kind of go through all that. All right, so first of all, go ahead, get the dates, the keywords down. Second Crusade, Third Crusade, Barbarossa, Philip, Richard, Massacre at Akko, Saladin, Fourth Crusade. All right, so all right, make sure you get all that down, and then we're going to go over to our map and start talking about it. All right, so back to our map. So Second Crusade around the year 1150 AD. Again, you don't need to memorize exact dates. They take the route in the green and they make their way again to the Holy Land. Why? Well, was there even a need for a Second Crusade? Well, about 50 years passed between the First and Second Crusades, and the Muslim forces aren't going to sit there and go, oh, well, they're going to start fighting back. And so, Second Crusade. Well, Second Crusade is a failure from the Western perspective. They go in there, they try to take over some real estate, and they fail miserably. So that's all you need to know about the Second Crusade. They're not doing well. So that leads us to maybe one of the most famous, the Third Crusade. And the Third Crusade is, around the year 1190. And the reason this crusade is so important is who's involved. So I gave you those three names there that you had on your list as the key terms. You want to write them down again, of course. And the three most powerful kings of Europe at the time went on this crusade. So it was King Richard I, Richard the Lionhearted from England. He goes on this crusade. It is the King of France at the time, Philip II, and Frederick Barbarossa, the King of Germany, or the Holy Roman Emperor. They all go on this crusade. So they go on this Third Crusade along with, against, I should say, the leader of the Muslim forces at the time, a man named Saladin. Saladin led the Muslim forces, very famous man in the East. And they go on this very dramatic crusade, very bloody, very brutal fightings that take place during the Third Crusade. So the Third Crusade rages on. And here's an image, I always like talking about this a little bit, of Richard the Lionhearted. Now, this is one of my little personal pet peeves. I'm going to go off on a little tangent. I don't do this too often, but I think this is important. So this is a sculpture of Richard the Lionhearted, and it's outside the Parliament building in England. Why am I stressing that? I'm going to show you an image of Saladin here in a second as well. The reason I'm stressing this is because Richard was not a nice guy. As we're going to talk about later on, Richard massacred thousands of unarmed Muslims. He's got a statue there outside Parliament in England. One of my biggest pet peeves as a historian today is how what we're doing in the United States with statues of past historical figures. And I cannot even wrap my brain around this idea of taking down all these historical statues of individuals. You do not do that. You don't erase the history. By that logic, the statue of Richard the Lionhearted shouldn't be there, nor should pretty much anybody who didn't meet our current ways of looking and thinking about things. And so the issue is not tear it down. The issue is you leave them and you teach everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful. And that's what you teach. You don't just erase it because, what they did back then, it doesn't work for what we do today. Especially look, even, Washington, Lincoln, people are tearing down things with Washington, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, it's really endless. And one of the things is you have to look at these men of their age. What were they like at their age and their time period? Yeah, you can make some arguments about things from, time periods and should it be in a museum or should it be, outside in public? And there's good discussions on that. But to just arbitrarily remove things, and I saw one story I read that really just kind of blew my mind, was in a museum they removed a statue of Theodore Roosevelt. And I'm like it's a museum, right? That's where this stuff, what are you going to do at that point? And so I don't know. It kind of comes and goes in waves of people wanting to do this or not. But again, it's a little completely off topic, I know, but I think it's important to think about. It's not completely off topic. It is an important historical issue, and this is a history class. So, anyways, that's Richard the Lionhearted. That's Saladin. And both of these men were very much involved in the Third Crusade. Saladin actually had a very good reputation of being very chivalrous. There's a story that that Richard was actually injured, and Saladin found out. So Saladin sent him one of his own doctors and his horse because he wanted Richard to be healthy and strong and be able to fight fairly. Long story short, with the Third Crusade, at the end of the day, Saladin is victorious. Richard does have a couple successes. One success he has is the city of Akko, but when he goes to that city of Akko, he is pretty brutal. What does he do in the city of Akko? Well, massacres a lot of people, as I mentioned earlier. Thousands of people you could see in this image are massacred at Akko. And so that's what's going on in the Third Crusade. So while Richard does win a couple battles, at the end of the day, Saladin wins. And at the end of the day, by the time we end the Third Crusade around 1192-ish, around that time period, the Muslim forces are back in charge. So after about 100 years almost, yes, the Christians had control of this holy sites, these holy lands, but now that's shifting back. So that ends the Third Crusade. So, important in the sense of big names involved, very bloody. Richard eventually is going to be killed coming back from the Crusades. And it also cost them a lot of money. I think that's the other really important point that I want you to jot down for the Third Crusade. It was very expensive. And the reason that's important is for the story of our last crusade, the Fourth Crusade, which I'll get to here in a second. So here we have the story of the Fourth Crusade, which in some ways is maybe the most interesting one. So the Fourth Crusade, this is what happens. Saladin, after the Third Crusade, Saladin dies, right? So Saladin dies, and the people in the West see this as an omen. Hey, Saladin is dead. Let's go on this Fourth Crusade. So they plan. The problem is they don't have money, right? The Third Crusade spent a lot of money, bankrupted them. That's the problem. So what they have to do is they go to Venice. And they go to Venice because Venice does have a lot of money. Venice is very wealthy. And so the Fourth Crusaders go to Venice and say, hey, they have money, they have ships, will you help us out? We want to go to the Holy Land. And the people in Venice say, well, we can help you, but you see this city down here called Zara, not too far from us? That city is a rival city for us. Maybe on the way you could stop there and sack that city. And the Crusaders say, sure, no problem. And they do. And then they begin to make their way further eastward. And they eventually approach Constantinople. So around the year 1200 AD, they're at Constantinople. This is all like 1202 to 1204, right? Circa 1200 is fine. And 1200 in Constantinople is the declining period of the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine emperor had some problems at the time. He was under threat. He was going to be overthrown. And his son, named Alexius, knows this is going on. And his son goes to the Crusaders. And he makes contact with the Crusaders. And he tells them, hey, you guys are knights. You fight. I need some military backup here. Will you help me and my father? I'll pay you money. I'll pay you 200,000 marks of silver. Now, 200,000 marks of silver is a lot of money. Just to give you an idea, the passageway from Venice to Constantinople would have been about 60,000 marks of silver. So 200,000 is a lot. And the Crusaders like, sure, we're in. Why not? That sounds good to us. And so sure enough, they get to Constantinople. And then they quickly discover that Alexius doesn't have the money. They're not happy. They do see this city of Constantinople as being a city that's been around for a long time, a lot of treasures, a lot of beautiful buildings, and they help themselves. They sack the city of Constantinople, they loot the city of Constantinople, and after they're done, this is key, they go back home. Bye-bye. They don't even go to the Holy Land. So then you have to wonder, what just happened? Holy Land? What just took place? They got paid and they went home. That's it. They're done. What happened was that at this point, we're seeing something shift. Remember, I told you at the beginning that the age of faith was important as to why the Crusades happened, but there were economic motivations. By the Fourth Crusade, the economic motivations seem to be more important because it's like, Holy Land, Schmoly Land, I got paid, I'm going home. And this is important because this is going to that theme of why the Middle Ages end, right? And we're seeing things shifting. Now, it's not a light bulb. It's not as though, okay, that's it, nobody cares about religion anymore. No. After the Fourth Crusade, there'll be other crusades all the way to the Holy Land. They won't succeed, but they'll make other attempts. But what we are clearly seeing by the 1200s is that faith is important, but so is money. And this is kind of the shift between the Middle Ages and the modern world. And this is when I say, the theme of understanding why the Middle Ages end, the Crusades play a part in that. So that's kind of what you want to know about the Fourth Crusade. All right, so then the last thing I kind of want to do is get into the impacts themselves of the Crusades. There's like 4 major impacts I want you to know of the Crusades. And some of it relates again to why the Middle Ages end. So let's start with the first impact I want you to know. And I didn't really put this down in key terms, but you do want to obviously get it all down. The first impact I want you to know is economic, right? And what I mean by that is a couple things. One economic impact is that a lot of these countries like England were bankrupted, especially fighting the Third Crusade, so that's important. But the other big economic impact is all these crusades for 100 plus years, moving east, west, west, east. What they're also doing is trading. And as you get more trade, you're bringing money, you're bringing ideas, you're bringing all sorts of new things from the east into the west. And as those new ideas and that money starts circulating into the west, it's going to kind of shatter a lot of the cultural and social norms of the Middle Ages and help bring about a modern world. So this is kind of the thing. We're going to come back to this more later, but it's not just, you're not supposed to just memorize dates and names in history classes. Understanding why things happen, and you really need to kind of understand why do the Middle Ages end. There are events that are going to do this, and the Crusades is one of them. As we get closer to the end of the Middle Ages, around 1400, we're going to see more dramatic events that even have a more dramatic impact. But even here in the Crusades, you can get a sense that things are changing, that you are getting to this point now where you are seeing things other than faith being important, right? Faith is going to even be important in the beginning of the modern world, but we're seeing things change. And so that's key. All right, so that's one. Second important impact is religious. And what I mean by that? Well, unfortunately, this is one of the negative impacts, but still an impact, that the Crusades create more tension between the Muslim and Christian communities. You already saw this earlier, remember, in Spain. Now you have the Crusades, and this is going to create a lot of kind of conflict between Muslims and Christians. Even to this day, if you go to the Middle East, they hear the word crusade and, not a very positive connotation. And you think of the massacre at Akko and things like that. So not a surprise. So that's one. There's another important religious impact that the Crusades have, and that's one that a lot of people don't know about. It's a religious conflict between the Greek Orthodox and the Latin Church, the Catholic Church. And what is that conflict? Well, when the Fourth Crusade takes place, by that point, Western Europe is under the Catholic Latin Church. Eastern Europe is Christian, but they're Greek Orthodox. The Crusade doesn't create the split. The split was already there. And so the Fourth Crusaders sacked Constantinople, a Christian Greek Orthodox city. And so the Greek Orthodox are really upset about this. How long are the Greek Orthodox upset with the Catholic Church? Well, whatever year it is today is the year they're still upset about it. They've never stopped being upset about it, right? Because it's not violent, it's not conflict, but I remember years ago Pope went to Greece to kind of return some relics that were taken from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, and people were just, we don't want him here, we don't like him. So kind of an interesting little side story, but still an interesting impact of the Crusades. So that's second, the political impacts. All right, so I'm sorry, the religious impacts. So first we have economic, then we have religious impacts. The third is political, and one of the important political impacts of the Crusades, and it's a bit ironic, is the whole point of the Crusades was to retake the Holy Land. Well, remember, the Fourth Crusade sacks the city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. What does it do to that city? Weaken it. And as it weakens it, it leaves them vulnerable for a Muslim power, specifically the Ottomans. Remember when we talked about the Byzantine Empire and the fall of it? Well, now, look, I would say this. The Byzantine Empire was going to fall regardless, right? They weren't going to be around forever. The Ottomans had really good timing moving in. But definitely the Fourth Crusade politically weakens the Byzantine Empire and later on helps the Ottomans take over. So that's another impact. And then one last impact of the Crusades, and this is something interesting. I haven't really got into detail on it much, but women. One of the effects, if you think of women in the Middle Ages, women in the Middle Ages in the West, especially noble women, they were pretty significant because think of what the men are doing. The men are all off fighting. And for 100 years, these noblemen are all fighting these crusades. Well, who's running the manors? Who's running the day-to-day events in the West? It's the women. We kind of saw this before. Remember with Athens and Sparta, where Sparta was very dominant, the women were more dominant in Sparta than Athens. That's why. So kind of a similar thing there. So anyways, that's kind of the Crusades in a nutshell. So you have quite a bit of information there that I just gave you. So again, you want to know all the causes. You want to know about the four crusades. You want to know about the key people during the third crusade and all of that. You want to know about the impacts of the crusade. And then already again, really start thinking about how the crusades help bring an end to the Middle Ages. It's not major. It's not going to be as dramatic again as other things we're going to see, but it is something that you want to start thinking about. All right, so I hope all that's clear. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.